Hi, good afternoon all. Thanks again for coming to another one of the SA UK Bilateral Chair's public lectures. This is the second of 2023, we're very happy and grateful to have Tshepo Madlingozi talk with us today. I'll introduce him properly in a moment. Before I do, just some simple house rules. Because it's a hybrid lecture, what we do is we ask those online to please, after the 45-minute to 50-minute talk, we will have an hour or so for questions and answers, and we would ask those of you online to please paste your questions on the chat, and I will read them out for the speaker. And obviously, we'll carry out the normal process internal to the room. So as I said, this week we have Tshepo Madlingozi. He is director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies at WITS, a local boy, which is nice. And he does so many things that I'm not even going to begin to cover them all, but just to say that he's got co-edited volumes on various aspects of human rights and law in South Africa by Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press, and he has a forthcoming book called Black Consciousness and the Remaking of the World. So look out for that. Today, Tshepo is going to be talking to us, as you've seen, on social movement struggles for decolonisation and reconstitution from below. Abahlali Mjondolo's strivings against pariahdom. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much, Dr. Dave, for the invitation and for putting it together. Thank you, those of you who are here physically and those of you online. Thank you. So I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes. I'm going to go over a bit, maybe share a bit, and then I look forward to exchanges and discussion. So I want to start with an epigraph by Saul Blakey that we all know, actually in 1916, but talking about the 1913 native Lancet, where he said, awakening on this date, the South African native found themselves not as a slave, but a pariah in the land of their birth. So that's Saul Blakey, who of course was an ANC, the first ANC Secretary General, or General Secretary as they used to call it then, talking about this new act that led to more dispossession, not the first wave of dispossession, but certainly, the first official consolidation of this position, 1913. We are now 2023, and the question is whether that sense of pariahdom of so-called natives has ended. So that's the first epigraph. But I wanted to, start with a poem, and the poem or a stanza from a poem. And the stanza is from A Return to My Native Land. A Return to My Native Land, a book poem by Amy Cisse, 1947, A Return to my Native Land. And I just want to quote one stanza. And it says, we do have to start. Start what? The only thing in the world worth starting. The end of the world, for heaven's sake. Close quote. We do have to start. Start what? The only thing in the world worth starting. The end of the world, for heaven's sake. Close quote. So I choose to open with this point because it highlights some of the themes that I'm going to be touching on today. The interrelated themes of, or the impacts of returning to remember, and all remembering as a precursor to ending the world. Okay? So if decolonization is to avoid being a metaphor, decolonization is to avoid just being a metaphor, It must propel the historically colonizing and the historically colonized to return and to remember themselves in order to end the world of global apartheid. Global apartheid, both at the global scale, but also internally, there are many different apartheids in our local context. More to the point, and to speak directly to the title of this talk, for us in the global south, the emancipatory horizon is the creation of the world, or rather, worlds plural, beyond the binary of south and north epistemologies. So that's my first edition, that the emancipatory horizon facing us in the global south is first of all to overcome the many global apartheids that we are facing, and therefore to create a world that goes beyond the binaries of what people call north and south epistemologies and ways of being in the world that come with that. The imperative to create the world is an urgent necessity in the context of two factors that make this imperative to end the world a necessity. One, the persisting abyssal line, and the term abyssal line, of course, comes from Witwatersrand Santos. The persisting abyssal line that designates some people as human beings and some people as not human beings, people who are discardable, who are invisible. The second necessity to create this world is this essential necessity due to the quickening planetary destruction of Mother Earth. So we are facing an existential crisis where the world seems to be ending. So those are the two huge necessities that make this imperative a absolute necessity. One, the continuing and persisting abyssal line, where some people are human beings, some people are human beings, and on the other hand, the quickening destruction of Mother Earth. So that becomes a decolonial struggle, and as I suggest, that takes us out of the notion that decolonization is just a metaphor. Of course, decolonization is also a metaphor. We can talk about this, to not just be a metaphor. So, Chair, I wish to dedicate this talk to Abahlali Mjondolo. So, as you know, Abahlali Mjondolo is almost 20-year-old, with over 50,000 members studying in KwaZulu-Natal, but now spread all over the country. It's a movement that campaigns for land, housing, but most importantly, for the recognition of the humanity of impoverished people. The so-called post-apartheid state has responded to its movement struggle with marginalization tactics, with delegitimization and repression, including, of course, wave of unlawful arrest, as well as the assassination of its leaders. 2023, we still see the assassination of political activists. In fact, just last year, not less than 4 Abahlali leaders were killed in this post-apartheid state. So I'm really abusing this platform to really call for collective solidarity, so that there might be justice and accountability for this assassination and for this ongoing repression. So I wish to dedicate this talk to this movement. The reason why the South African state has sought to destroy this movement is that in my reading, and as I will elaborate during the course of this talk, Abahlali is engaged in what we can call decolonization from below. Abahlali is engaged in what we can call decolonization from below. So that's, of course, protests take place in South Africa every day. In fact, some surveys say we have almost 2,000 protests a year, so-called social protests a year, one of the highest rates in the world. However, these protests tend to confine themselves to distribution claims. So claims and demands for electricity, water, healthcare, and so forth. That is not to say that the so-called civic delivery protests, that is to reduce it. But the focus is really on what we can call distribution claims. Abahlali has really distinguished itself from other movements and organizations by declaring that while there are short to medium-term demands are for land, housing, and the upgrading of shared settlements, their long-term vision is that of a world, and I quote, a world where everyone counts. That is their emancipatory vision, a world where everyone counts, quote, close quote. Abahlali's vision of constitution and belonging is thus in stark contrast to that of most impoverished people's organizations. Two most important elements distinguish Abahlali's struggles. Number one, most of these organizations, not all of them, accept the discourse of post-apartheid. So that's a first distinguishing element. Most of these organizations of impoverished people who are engaged in social protests accept the discourse of post-apartheid. And number two, they thus mobilize their poor subjectivity, being the poor of the poorest, as the saying goes, to demand basic services, and most importantly, to demand that they be integrated into the post-apartheid state. So they mobilize their poor subjectivity to demand ultimately to be integrated into the post-apartheid world. So that's why the people talk about being marginalized, being left out, and so forth. So a demand for integration. The reason why the state sought to suppress and really destroy Abahlali and Mjondolo is that this movement praxis is predicated on the rejection of the discourse of post-apartheid. And most importantly, Abahlali's struggle is a struggle to deconstitute the South African world of apartness, a world, of course, carved into zones of beings and non-beings, a world divided into those who count and those who don't count. So ultimately, Abahlali summarized their mission as follows, and I repeat, and I quote, "We are committed to a struggle for a world in which everyone counts." So a struggle to deconstitute South Africa. So that's the first contribution I want to make out of the three quick thoughts of four claims, three claims. The first claim is that Abahlali is engaged in a struggle to deconstitute the existing world in order to contribute, not alone, of course, to contribute to a world, to the building of a world where everyone counts. The second contribution that I wish to make today is that with a focus on historically settler colonial contexts, such as South Africa, Australia, Latin America, Canada, United States of America, South Africa, I wish to show that some movements of marginalized people are engaged in what we can call decolonisation from below. Here, I would like to invite us to think of decolonisation of society and the state beyond the spectacular, beyond the epochal, okay, as driven by national or nationwide movements. Therefore, my second contribution is that I've been inviting us to pay attention to what we can call everyday strivings for decolonisation by local groups. As I say, thinking of decolonisation beyond the spectacular, beyond the epochal. Everyday strivings for decolonisation. Lastly, and relatedly, I will use the case study of Abahlali and Mjondolo to show that everyday struggles of some impoverished peoples is ultimately a struggle against pariahdom. That some movements of indigenous people, black people, women, sexual minorities, non-nationals are not just engaged in what Nancy Fraser would call distribution or recognition claims. It goes beyond that when we are focusing on historically settler context. And that demands, if you look carefully, is a demand to end pariahdom. What do we mean by pariahdom? Pariahdom is the constitutive and ultimately foundational settler colonial condition that confines indigenous people, historically enslaved people, non-nationals, and other oppressed peoples to lived experiences of unhomeliness, homelessness, rootlessness, material impoverishment, and ultimately worthlessness. So pariahdom is really in all historically settler colonial contexts, is a foundational condition that really confines all these groups to unhomeliness, homelessness, rootlessness, material impoverishment, and ultimately worthlessness. To be worthless, to be without the world, to be worthless in a settler-created world is to be a perpetual pariah. Now, perpetual pariahs are faced with three choices. They are faced with three choices. The first choice is to accept or to acquiesce to settler futurity, and that's struggle for integration and assimilation. That's the first choice that is faced by a perpetual pariah in a settler-created world, is to accept settler futurity and therefore struggle for integration and assimilation. The second choice is to struggle for liminality and therefore constant fugitivity. So that's the second choice faced by a pariah, to really struggle for liminality, not integration assimilation, but to accept liminality and really struggle for constant fugitivity. The third choice, of course, is an attempt to forge a nationwide organization with a view of resisting colonialism or neocolonialism, colonization, and to implode this colonial world. So that's the third choice, a popular one that we all know: create a national organization in order to resist colonialism, colonization, and to implode this world. However, can we contemplate localized as opposed to national and non-armed collective challenges of pariahs that do not fall within this typology? This thought, in summary, is that an attempt at a global South contribution to social movement scholarship with the aim of demonstrating that in historically settler colonial context, beyond classic claims of distribution and recognition, a very famous distinction made by Nancy Fraser, beyond these classic claims of recognition and or distribution, many movements are engaged in everyday decolonization struggles against pariahdom. So that's the summary. Let me start with a big net that will explicate some of the main themes of this talk, the main themes of ongoing struggles against pariahdom and everyday struggles for deconstitution, decolonization, and reconstitution. This big net will be followed by a further explication of the notions of pariahdom, worthlessness, and decolonization from below. And in the last section, then I will focus on the case study of Abahlali and this movement struggle against pariahdom in the context of what I've been calling neo-apartheid constitutionalism. Okay, let's start with that big note. So in September 2009, dozens of heavily armed men attacked a meeting of the Kennedy Road Development. This committee is a founding affiliate of Abahlali. A section of these attackers set up on a Abahlali youth camp, while another made its way to sheds belonging to the president and the deputy president of Abahlali. Kennedy Road resembled a war zone after the attacks. 3 people were killed, dozens of people were injured, thousands of people were displaced, and sheds belonging to leaders of Abahlali had been either occupied or burned down. That was in 2009. Witnesses further alleged that the attackers self-identified as members of the ANC. Police subsequently arrested 12 members of Abahlali and not the attackers. The arrested members of Abahlali spent months in police custody. Tshepo Madlingozi, the president of Abahlali, then and now, spent several years underground in safe houses. In fact, that's the person that I met him when I went to interview him in 2009. And when I met him last year, he was still in hiding. in 2022. He was still in a safe house, unable to return to his house. This attack on Abahlali in 2009 marked a significant departure from the way they would ordinarily engage with social movements, such as the Provincial Forum, then the Western Cape Anti-Eviction Committee, and other such movements. In the past, the ANC and state officials dealt with these movements through a mixture of patronage, cooptation, delegitimization, and by arresting key leaders of the movement. As many commentators recognize at the time, this was the first time that the ANC or the state, via its local proxies, sought to destroy a whole movement. Tellingly, a day after this expulsion and attack of Abahlali, the provincial minister of safety and security came and declared that Kennedy Road is liberated, quote unquote. Kennedy Road is liberated. I open with this vignette because it highlights conflicting interpretations and enactment of liberation in post-colonial, post-apartheid South Africa. At a more profound level, this episode neatly summarizes the premise of this talk. The premise of this talk, of course, as I've been saying, is that historically conquered, enslaved, and other structurally oppressed people, they are striving for liberation, constitution, and belonging continue today. They are struggling for liberation, constitution, and belonging continue today. By constitution, I do not mean a legal instrument. Rather, I go back to the etymology of the term constitution. The etymology is constella, and that means to stand together. So I don't mean a legal, when I say struggle for constitution in the title and here, I don't mean a legal instrument. I mean the etymology, which is to stand together, as well as a decolonization imperative to constitute a post. This decolonization aspiration endures because constitutional rearrangements that have taken place in most settler contexts have either resulted in integration of historically colonized people into the existing settler world, or and in elite deals between the historically oppressed and the historically oppressing, whose outcomes are putatively post-colonial dispensation, while the majority of historically colonized oppressed people remain relegated into the underside of the new society. However, as we know, even under such seemingly hopeless conditions, decolonization and reconstitutive impulses never completely fade. In the case of South Africa, this intergenerational decolonization impulse was motored by a 19th century anti-colonial rallying cry that we all know, My Buye Africa. My Buye Africa, meaning return Africa, remember Africa, or resurrect Africa. Put differently, resurrect the world, remember the world, and return the world. My Buye Africa. Proponents of the My Buye vision strove to implode the world constituted by colonialists and to reconstitute the world in which everyone will have a sense of affective and material belonging. By reconstitution, therefore, I have in mind collective efforts aimed at establishing a substantially different kind of polity, a polity based on the filial praxis of Ubuntu. And I'm going to argue that Abahlali Mjondolo, while not saying so explicitly, continue this intergenerational impulse of My Buye Africa, the reconstituting impulse. So as we'll see that Abahlali later on, as we'll see later on, Abahlali's attempt to forge autonomous communities of pariahs is ultimately inspired by this decolonization and reconstitution vision. This is where the neo-apartheid. Okay, thank you. So I was still trying to explicate the notion of pariahdom. So pariahdom is an inherent settler colonial outcome caused by the fact that, unlike the colonialists needs home in order to create home elsewhere, the colonialists. And in these processes of homemaking and dehoming, in these very uneven processes of homing and dehoming, settler imperialists seek to displace, delegitimize, and suppress indigenous perceptions of the world, ways of knowing, relationship with the surrounding environment, and their spiritual anchorage. In a phrase, the settler aims to efface the native's way of being in the world. More than that, if the world, and I quote here, if the world is understood as a form of relating and being with, so if you think of the world as a form of being, becoming, and being belonging, a form of relating and being with, settler colonization and its Manichaean logic produces natives with the intention of expelling them from the world of fellow humans. That's a natural outcome of settler colonization. The uneven processes of homemaking and dehoming, as well as the production of so-called natives with the intention of expelling them from the world of fellow humans. Dehumanization and expulsion from the world of humans, quote unquote, follows from the fact that colonial and neo-colonial discourses are based on what Santos calls abyssal thinking. Abyssal thinking tends towards de-worlding because it interprets those who are pushed to the other side of the line as a quote, and a quote, invisible, unintelligible, and irreversibly discardable. That's abyssal thinking. This discourse figures so-called natives as non-existent. We have seen that last week, the Australian state or the Australian public was being invited to vote whether the Aboriginals should be recognized in the Constitution in 2023 in Australia, whether Aboriginals should be recognized as human beings in the Constitution. So abyssal thinking continues in all settler colonial contexts, producing natives, so-called natives, as non-existent. Could not exist. And here I quote John Luck-Nancy, the recently departed John Luck-Nancy, as he says in The Creation of the World Organization, the book, The Creation of the World Organization, quote unquote, it could no longer be in the world. We can also think pariahdom from the perspective of Hannah Arendt, writing the essay, The Jew as Pariah. The Jew as Pariah, where he says, to be a pariah is to be a citizen of nowhere, to be without the world. So here's the main point. In historically colonial societies, structurally oppressed people and invisibilized people suffer from more than the denial of their human rights. They suffer more than the denials of human rights. These groups suffer from being without the world, worldlessness. Therefore, in these circumstances, a liberal struggle for human rights will not suffice. A human rights struggle in an undecolonized setting could actually be an integrationist struggle that leads to assimilation and therefore internal colonization. Therefore, I want to argue that in historically settler contexts, where there was democratization but not decolonization, a struggle for human rights is a mistake, because that kind of struggle will actually lead to assimilation and therefore internal colonization, not colonialism, of course, but colonization. In such a context, only a decolonization and reconstitution struggle could lead to rewilding and thus constant, therefore standing to the Constitution. Again, as is well known, this was the motivation behind the anti-colonial principle of my Africa, remembering the world, reciting the word, retaining the word, my Buya Africa. At a more profound level, my Buya Africa was it's a historical response to the fact of Ilizwe Lifile. So in the late 19th century, indigenous people were regularly quoted as making this cry, Ilizwe Lifile. Ilizwe Lifile meaning the nation, or indeed the world is dead. The nation, or indeed the land is dead. This cry sought to convey the sense that conquest, colonization, land disposition and displacement, and the attendant processes of settler homemaking led to death of the world and thus worldlessness. Ilizwe Lifile, the response being my Buya Africa, not a civil rights struggle. The world is dead, Ilizwe Lifile. The response must be my Buya Africa, not just the return of the world, but the remembering and the remaking of the world. The outcome of death of the world, Ilizwe Lifile, and institutionalized processes that guaranteed settler future is perpetual pariahdom for the historically conquered and enslaved, and a sense of belonging for settler colonizers. Therefore, every request for decolonisation, reconstitution, and belonging must and do encompass not just the political, but the spiritual, the material, the social, and therefore social, spiritual, material, not just the political dimension. It includes all these dimensions towards rebuilding. In the case of South Africa, this quest for remaking takes place in the context of what I've been calling neo-apartheid constitutionalism. As I will show below, neo-apartheid constitutions contain the best features of a Euro-American constitution, and therefore leading to the transformation of society, not the decolonization of society. So neo-apartheid constitutions are not apartheid constitutions, because of course they lead to transformation, as we saw in South Africa in 1994. However, they don't lead to decolonization. Transformative constitutionalism does not and cannot end the satellite created world. Transformative constitutionalism does not and cannot end the satellite created world as I've been describing it. It transforms the world mainly by extending civil, political, and social-economic rights to historically oppressed people, and by enabling claims for distribution of social goods from the state. Movements of pariahs such as Abahlali thus engage in constitutionalism tactically, not strategically. Movements such as Abahlali that are concerned with decolonization of the world, I want to argue, therefore engage with transformative constitutionalism tactically, not strategically. Abahlali versus Mjondolo exemplify this ambivalent approach and attitude towards a constitution that cannot end pariahdom. So I wanted to describe the origins of Abahlali, but I think I will skip that in the interest of time. In the remainder of the paper, I wish to show that a close reading of Abahlali's strategy, tactics, and vision reveals that while this movement's slogan, you know, that slogan of Umhlaba, Izulu, and Situnzi, land, housing, dignity, that's the slogan. While this slogan is cast in terms that seems like a typical distribution or recognition framework, Abahlali's injustice claim, their main injustice claim, they call it unfreedom. Unfreedom. Their injustice claim, it's not human rights violations, but it's what they call unfreedom. And therefore they wish to fundamentally reconstitute South Africa. Abahlali's collective action efforts are therefore impaired by the idea that the post-apartheid state is yet to come. Is that notion? Should we continue?
Yes, you can continue.
Okay. So Abahlali's collective action efforts are therefore impelled by the idea that the post-apartheid world is yet to come, and that impoverished Black peoples and women are therefore, their condition of pariahdom subsist. Abahlali names this situation of ongoing pariahdom as that of unfreedom. That's every year on the 27th of April when we celebrate and we mark Freedom Day. Abahlali on the 27th of April, they stage what they call we mourn Freedom Day, quote unquote. So every year on the 27th of April, they stage what they call mourning and Freedom Day rallies. So writing on the 20th anniversary of the supposed end of apartheid, Abahlali summed up their members' experience of unfreedom, neo-apartheid, and ongoing dehumanization as follows, and I quote. This was on the 20th anniversary of the supposed end of apartheid. And I quote, 20 years after apartheid, we live like pigs in the mud. Our children die of diarrhea. We are forced into transit camps at gunpoint. The police beat and shoot us in the streets, and assassins kill us with impunity. If we stand up and demand that our humanity is recognized, if we stand up and demand that our humanity is recognized, we are removed from the housing list and we are placed on the death list. We are removed from the housing list and we are placed on the death list. From this vantage point, to be rendered pariah is therefore to be rendered anachronistic and thus non-existing and discardable. In this regard, the President of Abahlali implores marginalized people to resist unfreedom because, as he says, in this space and time of unfreedom, we are treated, quote unquote, as beneath the law, as if we are beneath the law. Another leader of Abahlali adds that a person trapped in pariahdom is a humanoid whose, quote, whose life and voice does not count. Therefore, in the lived experiences of members of Abahlali, then the neo-apartheid positionality of pariahdom is a positionality of radical homelessness. It's a positionality of radical homelessness. By radical homelessness, I'm suggesting that individuals and groups suffering from pariahdom continue to be trapped in what Franz Fanon famously, with reference to colonial Algeria, South Africa, recognized as a zone of non-peace. That's what the personality of pariahdom means. It is therefore of no small significance that Abahlali consistently link the notion of having a voice and that of having a life. Abahlali here is bringing attention to the fact that marginalization from structures of governance, exclusion from the realm of civil society, and structural invisibility are markers of being thought of and treated as less than human, to be undrivable, to be killed and be undrivable, as Judith Butler would put it. Abahlali therefore conclude that even under conditions of constitutionalism and rights talk, quote, if you are poor and Black, you can be killed with impunity, undrivable lives. Abahlali's designation of this time as a time of unfreedom is meant to convey the idea that this is a time, neither the time of apartheid, neither the time of freedom, nor the time of freedom. Rather, Abahlali seeks to show us that the post-1992 period is an interregnum in which most Black people find themselves interned in a space that the former Secretary General of Abahlali called the space of democratic peace. What does it mean to be in a democratic peace, quote unquote? Therefore, any attempt to understand Abahlali's counter-hegemonic practice of constitution and belonging must begin with the understanding that Abahlalism is grounded in the radical refusal that is a time of post-apartheid. The discourse, as we know, the discourse of post-apartheid permits beneficiaries of South Africa's elite transition, to quote beneficiaries of South Africa's elite transition to manufacture the concept that 1994 presaged both liberation and emancipation. From a Foucauldian perspective, this hegemonic discourse of post-apartheid is meant to mold the subjectivity of marginalized people in a way that induces them to internalize the idea that they are not casualties of structural problems, but rather because the past is in the past, they themselves are the problem. To be sure, if you look at the discourse of poverty management in South Africa, the discourse of poverty management is premised on this idea that the poor themselves are a problem. So what Abahlali says that this is a time of apartheid. They seek to refuse and to discard this notion of post-apartheid. The mission that Abahlali has set for itself therefore differs from the missions of other groupings of marginalized people, because their mission is to totally eradicate and overhaul the edifice of South Africa. Of course, South Africa, this settler-created colony that was never changed, 1994, being democratization and not decolonization, being not the transformation of the state, but the transformation of government, continues. Therefore, the end of South Africa is the end of pariahdom. Let me conclude. So in the previous section, I mentioned that there are 4 consequences of colonialist attempts, never fully successful by the way, colonialist attempts to expel colonized people from the world of humans. I said there were 4 main consequences. 1, namelessness and homeliness, rootlessness, and homelessness. So namelessness and homeliness, rootlessness, and homelessness. Those are the 4 conditions or elements of pariahdom. Abahlali's dedicated attention to these consequences and the resistance to all 4 of these consequences can be seen respectively in the fact that 1, and the first one is namelessness. This movement of historically anonymous and discoverable people have attached a name to themselves. And this name is based on appropriating an identity, being a shared dweller, an identity that historically is associated with illegality, shame, and pariahdom. They've appropriated that name, Abahlali was Mjondolo. It doesn't sound like a radical name, but from the perspective of this thing, this element of pariahdom, namelessness, it's a pathogen, an appropriation of an identity historically associated with shame, illegality, and pariahdom. Secondly, they challenge this notion of unhomeliness, unhomeliness in that they, in all their settlements or in their major settlements where they have occupied them, they've set up daycare centers, they've set up creches, they've set up choirs, they've set up football teams, they've got religious groups and so forth. Resisting this idea that to be marginalized, to be a pariah, is to be living in conditions of unhomeliness. Number 3, they resist the notion of rootlessness by forging local and very durable, I must say, translocal and transnational alliances. So you will see that Abahlali has got partners and alliances throughout South Africa, and not just in so-called spaces of social movements, but with academics, with trade unions, and so forth. But also they forged a trans-global or transnational alliances in Brazil, in Kenya, sending their members there, other people coming here. So resisting this notion of that to be without the world is to be rootless, to be without roots. And then lastly, the notion of homelessness. Of course, they resist homelessness by occupying unused land and really resisting that displacement and mobilizing for land and housing. Following from the above outline, we can conclude that Abahlali is engaged in a struggle to reclaim belongingness in the world. I repeat, following from the above outline, we can conclude that Abahlali is engaged in a struggle to reclaim belongingness in the world. Therefore, even though this movement's constituency, their main constituency, is made up of shared dwellers, and that of necessity, that demands will be for water, electricity, land, housing, upgrading of settlement. Their long-term vision is a striving for freedom and coexistence. Let me quote what they said in 2006. Let me quote what they said in 2006 about freedom. And I quote, "Freedom for us is a way of living, not a list of demands to be met. Freedom for us is a way of living, not a list of demands to be met. Delivering houses will not do away with labor, it will do away with labor of houses, but it won't make us free. Freedom is a way of living where everyone is important, where everyone's intelligence and experience counts. We've always said that we are not free because even many of the people who say they are for the status of the pure, NGOs, academics, refuse to accept that we can think for ourselves." Those quote. With this quote, Abahlali therefore is accepting the fact that the epistemology born in struggle is an decolonizing epistemology. Thus, if the neo-colonialist act of denying the colonized power of nationality, one of Abahlali's main struggle is to resist this idea that to be poor is not to think. Therefore, you will know that they've got, the University of Abahlali, they've got funds for non schools where they debate these issues, and they regularly proclaim that they are professors of their own suffering. So really, resisting this notion that only historically oppressive people are the ones who think. Abahlalism, and I'll end here. Abahlalism is therefore a consciousness and a field of praxis that Abahlali employs to cease apprehending themselves through the imposed lens of racism and classism. Therefore, they refuse this notion of double consciousness. A mindset based on Abahlalism enables Abahlali and other damned people of the earth to reject the new apparent discourse that the poor are undifferentiated and willing carriers of social disease, to quote Franco Casey. Seen through the lens of Abahlalism, the post-1994 political and social dispensation is a problem that needs radical reconstruction, not the people themselves. Abahlalism therefore enables impoverished Black people and other people to resist the neo-colonial discourse and therefore to rather recognize their own humanity. In this way, members of Abahlali remember themselves so they can begin deconstructing the myth of post-apartheid and put this situation of freedom on track. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks for that really powerful and fascinating talk. Tshepo, we now open matters up to the floor and the chat room. So I think we'll start with those in the room initially, and then we'll move on to the chat. That's all right with you. You want to take one at a time or groups? Groups are fine. Okay. So any questions?
You're two online.
No, I'm sure there'll be some. There you go. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. I have a question on just with So just looking at the slogan of Abahlali, which is this simply translated as housing, land, and dignity. I just want to focus on the last point, which is dignity, because I think if we're to make an analysis and also to be fair, most of the time people just think that dignity comes as a result of the two, housing and the land. However, so this is a question to you now as a diploma scholar. So, do you think that there is enough contribution from the scholarship, which is the decolonial scholarship, to complement the strivings of Abahlali Mjondolo? Because it's just mentioned in your presentation that they focus more on the issues of the Abahlali technically. So they respond to their issues in a technical sense, and they're institute from below. But then, how does then the scholarship itself respond to the cries and also to the strivings of Abahlali Mjondolo? Not just as reciting what we're talking about, but we must remember that also, like when you first presented, you talked about the world whereby someone matters and someone doesn't matter. We are living in a world of what Paul would call the West and the rest. So you have two opposites side. So how does then the scholarship of decolonisation and also decoloniality then try to complement the cries and also the struggles of Abahlali Mjondolo, taking into context that the world that we're living in today is a world that was created by the Enlightenment era, whereby it's sort of like, but it's sort of like, imagine how a world outside from what people used to believe in during the medieval Europe, into now thinking about the new world where like there was Enlightenment thoughts. The Enlightenment thoughts brought colonialism. The Enlightenment thoughts is the one that also like brought apartheid into its way of thinking about certain people. It's led to people doing what they call exploration at that time. We are civilizing people. But however, the conditions that movements like Abahlali Mjondolo and many other movements that are existing, which we not know of, are products of the Enlightenment era. So then how then just the decolonial scholarship then try to reimagine how the world was reconstructed back in the days, how then like are we trying to practically think of that kind of a world whereby everyone is actually free as how the Abahlali Mjondolo would want to see the world. Thank you very much.
One more. We're going to do groups, so but one more. Let's take these two. Okay.
Thank you, Prof. I think it's commendable what Abahlali stands for in society. And I wonder if they identify.
It's not working.
Yes. Got it?
Close.
Okay. So, like I was saying, I think it's commendable what Abahlali is doing, stands for in society. I don't know if they identify as a civil movement or a political party, but I guess it should be there. My question is, do you know that the area of the Abahlali independence will contest for elections in 2024? I think maybe they will be activism on the quality of life. The activism on the quality of life, be able to consider issues of informal settlements through lens of right to development in South Africa. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for those two questions. And the point, colleagues, is not to romanticize Abahlali, because let's be clear. It's not to romanticize. But to go to your point, most decolonial or decolonisation scholarship has got two limitations. The first limitation is what you alluded to towards the end, which is to, not all of it, of course, to romanticize the pre-colonial period. And as you said, how do we recuperate, how do we reconstruct the world before enlightenment and so forth? We can never reconstitute that world. We can never remember that world. So when we talk about my pariah Africa, we're not talking about literally to return to Africa. That's why when I use my pariah, I say return, resurrect, remember. So not only literal returning to the pre-colonial world, right? Is the idea that the world is structured into those who are human beings, those who are not human beings. And those who are said to be non-human beings, are faced with those three things that I was talking about. The demand that they must assimilate into this world or to remain perpetual pariahs. The idea that they cannot think, right? So I ended on that note that Abahlali's epistemology is an epistemology born in struggle, and therefore it's a decolonizing epistemology born in struggle. Now, an epistemology or knowledge born in struggle is a knowledge that produces new knowledge that contests the knowledge produced by historical colonizers. But number three, seek to recreate the world, not in a nativist fashion. So I wanted to end on this note, but there was no time. That, and let me say what I said here. The first point that I wish to make is Abahlali's desire to contribute to the remaking of the world in a creolizing way, and that's beyond epistemologies of the South or even native discourses. Abahlali values principles of syncretism and interculturality. We can discern this from the fact that shared settlements attributed with Abahlali actively, number one, embraces people who self-identify with various ethnicities, races, nationalities, and even political parties. Furthermore, we have discovered that this movement displays a wide variety of tactics, symbols, and ideas in pursuit of that target. They call it, in their books, in one of their booklets, they call this living learning. And this is how they summarize this living learning. What I'm going, and this is the president of Abahlali saying this. What I'm going to suggest right now is that since we are coming from different backgrounds, from different spectrum of life, we've grown up in different environments and from different walks of life, we should put all those experiences and skills together. Those folks. Such a coming together enables pluralization of national consciousness in the world. So it's not this decolonization that, as I said, is nostalgic of people in their world, but it's also not nostalgic of the creation of a native consciousness or a recuperation of native consciousness. That would be a mistake, because of course the native only comes into existence when the settler arrives, right? The native comes into existence only when the settler arrives. So to say we are planning to be natives again, it's a big mistake, right? So that's a first. So that's a first that Abahlali can teach us, right? That knowledge, epistemology born in struggle, is a decolonizing epistemology that leads to material changes, but also that resists the colonizing epistemology. The second limitation of decolonial scholarship, we say, what can it teach us, is that, most of us are focused for the correct reasons on, countering Western knowledge, right? And countering Western ways of viewing the world. So very abstract sometimes, very intellectual sometimes, but doesn't tell us how to get there. Or to put differently, it doesn't tell us that scholarship, who are the constituent powers or who are the actual movements that can lead to decolonization. So what I'm proposing here is that Abahlali is one example of a concrete movement that can lead to this. Finally, I want to say that I've got a 2006 paper, and the title is Progressive Legal Scholars and Social Movements. Here's the title. But the subtitle is Beyond the Ivory Tower. Beyond the Ivory Tower. You can find it online. And there I was making the argument that if we are to say we are progressive scholars or decolonizing scholars in today's language, and that was the first time I was thinking about Abahlali in 2006, we need to embed ourselves in this movement. Not in a way that romanticizes this movement, but we've got a lot to learn. So to answer your question, the second part of your question, we need to go beyond the ivory tower, and we can learn a lot from struggles that are happening on the ground without romanticizing them. Because those struggles, I repeat, they are resisting material impoverishment, which is something that decolonial scholarship also doesn't focus on. They focus on knowledge and symbols, not material. For example, capitalism is never put on trial in many decolonial scholarship. You know, what is a decolonizing world in a capitalist world? That doesn't make sense. Movement like Abahlali can teach us that kind of decolonial epistemology that resists capitalism, also resists enlightenment or Western knowledge. I don't know what's the second point. Oh, voting. So that's what I was saying. That's what Roman says Abahlali. So in the northern elections before this, like the national elections before that, Abahlali took a decision that as a group they will vote for the DA, the Democratic Alliance. Right? They took a decision that as a group they will vote for Democratic Alliance. And some of us were shocked and quite upset, actually, you know, that how can Abahlali vote for this neoliberal white supremacist party in some accounts, right? But they explained it that we were saying that they've lost hope in the ANC. The ANC is actively replacing them. Is there any other party that we can engage in a technical partnership with so they can get finance, houses, land, and so forth? So they made that decision that we're not going to run as independence, but as a bloc, we're going to vote for the DA, right? Yeah, but in terms of elections, most movements have taken a decision that elections are bourgeois, you know, processes. They are simply bourgeois, and it can never lead to a radical reconstruction of society. So I don't foresee. So Abahlali has since reversed, you know, that thing that they vote for the DA. But I don't think they will ever run as independents. I don't think so, because as I said, they know that the constitution has got limitations, and they know that elections also have limitations. Yeah.
So many thanks. Hi, can you hear me right? So we now have two questions from the chat box. The first is from Richard Pitthouse. You provide a rich account of the context and self-ascribed meaning of Ubuntu Labampofu via concepts like pariahdom, the Abyssal line, the impulse to reconstitute Mayibuya Africa, and the movement's own language of Isitunzi, Ubuntu, Unfreedom, Abahlali, etc. And note this exceeds the constraints of a civil rights project, and that the movement's engagement with constitutionalism is tactical. What are your thoughts on how this richness, with all its political implications, is symbolically eviscerated by the way in which NGOs mediate the presentation of the movement in the elite public sphere via human rights discourse? For example, a movement intellectual and leader like the late Ndogule Nguni, a young man with deep thoughts about land, dignity, community, history, coloniality, the meaning of being human, and so on. Many of them Africanist, others drawn from struggles around the world, appears in the Daily Maverick as a human rights defender. That was a quote. Then there's another question from Gilbert Moela. Is decolonization even possible, especially if the same tools and systems of colonization are employed in attempts to decolonize? The bottom line is that the decolonization movement itself needs to be decolonized. We cannot decolonize the system using the same logics, dynamics, and paradigms that birthed it in the first place. We cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. Are there any Afrocentric methods that we can use for decolonization as Black Africans? There's another question there, but I'll just leave it as two because they're both very rich questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for those two questions. I won't do full justice to them, but just to go back to your question about dignity. As you noted that Abahlali's slogan is land, housing, and dignity. And you're quite right to say that, you know, most middle class people think dignity can be achieved or reclaimed or reasserted by just giving people houses and finance and so forth. But as you implicitly stated, that is not enough. And as Abahlali said, dignity ultimately is about destroying this accounting. and internal accounting, and that housing land will allow us to live, but does not really give us dignity. And to connect your point to the first question by Richard, there's a way in which, and of course, as you know, I run a human rights center, right? There's a way in which NGOs can deliver, listen to the language, deliver houses or struggle on behalf, this is the language, of poor people, and deliver houses and toilets and upgrade of settlements in a way that takes away people, where people are empowered, demobilized, de-radicalized, and ultimately infantilized. They are doing things for you. So I just want to go back to your question of dignity. Absolutely correct. Dignity, there's a way of delivering houses and other basic services in a way that further, destroys people's dignity. So you're quite, and Richard is also quite correct. That first question that, there's a way in which NGO people, interact with movements of impoverished people, such as Abahlali and others, in a way that reduces them to passive recipients of service delivery, passive recipients, where this fight is fought between us lawyers, academics, judges, and lawyers. Very, technocratic solutions, right? And that is a dominant way in which NGOs and others engage with movements of impoverished people and engage in poverty, so-called poverty management. So, I really want to underline that point that Richard makes. That's why Abahlali insists that we are professors of our own suffering. There is not just an intellectual thing. It's a way of seeing the world, and it's also, I want to argue, a way of remaking the world. We shall remake the world in a way that we think is best, because we have theorized the world from our own perspective. And that the problem, as Richard also said, is not just the denial of human rights. And therefore, Abahlali is a human rights organization. In my forthcoming book and elsewhere, I've quoted interviews where we interviewed Abahlali, where they say, we are not a human rights movement. Explicitly, we are not a human rights movement. That will shock a lot of people because, in South Africa, if you struggle for water, and people say you are struggling for human rights. No, it's beyond that. It's beyond that. It's beyond that. And, Nguni, who I also met last year, who was assassinated. And I went to his talk at the Forge, where he gave a powerful speech about what they stand for. And where he also said, people said, are you not scared of dying? 3 of your leaders have died, have been killed. No, I'm not scared, I'm struggling. And of course, he was killed. There's someone who, if you listen to his speeches, if you interact with him, his way of being, this is not someone who's arguing for human rights and integration and assimilation. This was someone who was fighting for more than that, But there's a tendency, Richard and colleagues, to reduce even Steve Biko. People like Steve Biko as a civil rights activist. When the commemoration of Steve Biko every year, please look how people describe Steve Biko, including by the Steve Biko Foundation itself, right? Steve Biko was a civil rights leader. Or Martin Luther King was a civil rights leader. Martin Luther King was more than that. That's why he was killed. As Chris was struggling for civil rights, it was okay. Once he started talking about communism, he had to die. And some people say, for non as a human rights activist. So it's not unique to South Africa. There's a tendency to appropriate, to de-radicalize, to flatter, this activity. The second question from Gilbert, thank you for that question. Is it even possible to decolonize? And the answer is of course no. You can't, as you say, I agree fully with your comment. Let me say that as a lawyer, I concur with your comment. You can't dismantle the master's house with the master's logic. Actually, it's interesting because they refuse the township. And as you know, the township it's a black location. They refuse the black location. They refuse a suburb. So if you go to Kennedy Road itself, it's in a liminal space. It's not in the township, it's not in the suburbs. So they're refusing this spatial justice notion that we have as NGOs and human rights organizations, that we are fighting to stop evictions, from high-rise building, from townships and so forth. They're also refusing that they should just, engage in the struggle to live in backyards in suburbs. They're in the middle. So that's the first clue that these people, perhaps, their logic exceeds the logic of the normal ways of doing things, of ultimately integration. You know that last scene in Django, the movie Django, where this guy has killed the master and the master's servant and so forth. And what does he do? He doesn't take over the house. He burns the house. So that's why I started with that poem. That's why I started with that poem by Anisi said. We do have to start what? The only thing in the world we're starting, the end of the world for goodness sake. The end of the world. Not the integration into South Africa, and therefore you transform it into new South Africa. And those are people to about South Africa. Their horizon was Tanzania, a myth, of course, a myth. But not South Africa, not new South Africa, but a myth that transcends South Africa called Tanzania. Right? So you're part of that group that, you can't use the same logics. Do I have examples? No, I don't have good examples from around the world. But yeah, you can't use the same logics.
There were 2 more questions online.
Anyone in the room before I go back to the chat talks?
Oh, thanks.
Okay, so there are 2 more questions online. The first from Stanley Malamacha. Abahlali want a world, I think he's quoting you, I'm not sure. Abahlali want a world where everyone counts. Prof, our constitution is celebrated as one of the best in the world, particularly on its recognition and protection of fundamental human rights. Prof Mutua asks a fundamental question. Who is the human in human rights? This question is about provoking, especially looking at the plight of Abahlali and other marginalized groups. What alterations, if any, can be made to the South African fabric so that it becomes a, quote, a world or society where everyone counts? That's the end of the question. The next question is from Petsani Madizvi Handla. Apologies for the Handila. Prof, you mentioned the fact that the struggle to attain human rights in a settler colony is a wrong method of struggle, and the only solution is decolonization. And also the use of transformative constitutionalism as a method of struggle does not answer the challenges we have. Taking this thesis incognizant into the post-1994 polity that has been established with all its limitations, what are the possibilities in terms of achieving decolonization, given the fact that we cannot achieve it through an armed struggle, for example? Does the ballot represent an alternative to this, drawing lessons from Latin America as a case study?
Thank you for those 2 questions. Stanley's question, Mutua, I think it means essay, who is a human in human rights? And that essay by Mjondolo shows that the human in human rights is the idea of enlightenment. It's like the idea of enlightenment. Right? That the human continued this notion of to be white, the middle class to be heterosexual, way even before the enlightenment was to be human. And that is a human in human rights. So that's why some people can be killed with impunity, even in a state that is celebrated all over the world, for human rights. You remember that scene in Minor Showdown, where, you know, what's the name of Joseph, where he's begging the miners to go, you know, from the court, he said, please, please leave, and he kneels down and say, and he's crying, please, please leave. The life of a black man is cheap. They're going to kill you and they will replace you tomorrow, you know. And they did, you know, killed what they meant. Even today, you know, there's no. So, to struggle for human rights when you are deemed not to be a human, it's a false struggle, because you are already not in the realm of being human. So that's why the first act by the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, on the 21st of March, it was not just for against passes. As it made it clear, this is the first, you know, this is the first slab in a radical reconstitution, you know, with the mental, mental emancipation, something like that. Because both them and their consciousness later on, they understood that the first act is to decolonize the idea of human, not to wish to be human like the white man. The first time, if you look at the PAC, if you look at the Black conscious movement, if you look at feminist, radical feminist movements, and if you look at later on at, you know, movements of sexual minorities, the first act is to decolonize the idea of what it means to be human. But if you struggle to be human like the professor, it's already a loss. So the human rights, including for today, is still a certain standard. Still a certain standard that is not decolonizing. And Petani's question about, you know, what are the means of decolonizing? You know, we had the Mandela Foundation on Tuesday, when we had a panel discussion on some of these issues. And there's a sense of fear that there's an upcoming unled revolution. And if you listen to, if you read the High Panel Presidential Report on the 2021 unrest, the unrest in June, when almost 40 people were killed. You know, I asked my students, how many people were killed? They said to me, maybe 40, maybe 30. Almost 40 people were killed. It's not a scandal. And of course, the spark was maybe, you know, one politician's arrest, but it was more than that. And the High Panel Presidential Report, if please read that report, it's short, it's very precise. It says towards the end, at the end, the conditions are still the same. The conditions that led to that uprising are still the same. And we fear that it's going to happen again. And between then and now, the state has not done anything to change the conditions. So, yeah, I mean, all of us in civil society, so-called civil society, we are always tender to say, there's something coming, an unled revolution. So the ballot, now you're quite a as you implicitly say, you know, the ballot is not the way to achieve political change. We don't have left organizations anymore. We don't have left organizations, right? We don't have left movements. Trade unions have imploded. Trade unions are engaged in internal, you know, civil war, including Petani's federation, you know. They're all engaged in internal civil war, you know. So we don't have the left anymore, whether at the political party level or the movement level. Social movements that are trying to organize are repressed. So the ballot is not the way to go. Amsterdam seems to be out of the picture, but I'm afraid that, yeah, so that is unsustainable. It's truly unsustainable. You know, this doesn't make sense. So populism will win the game. Not decolonization, but populism. You know, so that's my fear and prediction, that, you know, not decolonization, but the radical change is going to come through populism, which leads to long-term disaster. You know? But yeah, in terms of outside of the ballot and Amsterdam, I don't know what can lead to decolonization. What I try to do with this paper is to call attention to everyday strivings for decolonisation by local groups. Is the solution then to unite all these separate groups into some sort of a UDF, where we romanticize the UDF once again? I don't know the answer to that.
Are there any questions in the room? If I may, as chair, I have a thought stroke question. This has been really fascinating. Thank you again. South Africa historically, partly to do with apartheid, but for lots of other reasons, has tended to see a lot of its, you mentioned of UDF as opposite here, has tended to see a lot of its change come from below, from these kinds of movements. And the power of the NGO, whether positive or negative, is thus sort of exaggerated in South Africa, as compared to other parts of the world. So I wonder whether we are sometimes in a situation in which we emphasize the power of local level movements, whether they're well represented or badly represented by NGOs, in generating change. And the reason I ask the question is because, not just because some people will call me an old school statist, but it's because even a radical movement like Abahlali, they're in a sense caught between a structural dimension that determines their tactics and their strategies, where they have to use human rights, they have to use various kinds of ways of achieving specific goals. They may have visions beyond it, as you wonderfully articulated, but much of their strategies and tactics are determined by the overall structure, be it constitutional, policy-related, government-imposed, etc. So there's a sort of missing middle here, and that is that maybe the function of dare I use the word intellectuals is to take some of those ideas and direct the critique at the structure. In other words, direct the critique at the fact that the South African Constitution isn't this amazingly liberating institution after all. The electoral system that we put in place by apartheid is far from liberating. In other words, the function of these kinds of discussions ought to be to critiquing existing institutions and practices that reinforce the neo-apartheid that we put in there.
Yeah, thank you for that. We've got myself and two colleagues have got a paper called Choice from No Choice. Choice or Choose from No Choice. It is a direct quote from one of Abahlali's speeches, one of their leaders. Choice from no choice. So over-determined, maybe structurally determined. As I said, they have to use, the Constitution practically. It's easy for Tshepo, a philosophy professor, to sit and say, using the law co-opts you. It's stupid. Don't use the law. That's a middle class, answer. People have to use all the available arsenal, including the law, tactically, not strategically. Right? So yeah, I want to say that I completely agree that even Abahlali is limited based on that technical repertoires, going to court, occupying, marching, sit-ins, organizing, even though they've got other revolutionary, and I must say, I've engaged with a lot of critical legal scholars who say, don't use the law. But I've been able to show that Abahlali uses the law to give himself a breathing space so they can do other so-called radical things, you know. If they didn't do that, they would have been catched a long time ago. And I can show you examples of anti-police forum and all those other movements, you know, who shunned the law, but where are they today? You know, so choices from no choices. And really, even us as NGOs, we have a lot of ideas, to be honest. So we have got 3 big ideas now as NGOs, 3 big things that we want to do. 1, BIG. That's what we're studying for, BIG, basic income card. All of us are putting all our eggs in that basket, basic income card. Not radical redistribution, but basic income card. Not reparation, not restitution, not wealth tax, basic income card. All of us are struggling for that, and money is coming. It is good money for philanthropies, you know, coming on that. The second one that all of us are struggling for is electoral reform. Electoral reform. How do we make sure that people are MPs, are people's representatives, not party representatives? So all of us are struggling for electoral reforms. Have more independence. Candidates running. You know, it's easy to dismiss all those things. But what do we do in the situation of a mafia state? In the context of state collapse, number 2. 3, in the context where the local groups that we romanticize, people are so impoverished that they are engaged in survivalism. So for us to say, go protest, let's weep, let's mobilize. People are engaging struggle to survive, survivalism. So here I don't know the answer because of all these things that I said, you know, the crisis of capitalism, the crisis of liberal democracy, and then the crisis of, you know, a poverty of ideas, you know. And every day an NGO is being formed in South Africa because we romanticize NGOs. And we say, back then, civil society. So every day a social justice NGO is being formed, you know, or some of us are expanding. Because that's how we romanticize, you know, based on our history, BDF, Black Sash, and so forth, you know. We romanticize this space, you know. So when you say maybe the idea is to critique and launch trenchant critiques that will change the state's mind, these guys are against us. No. We're not dealing with people who can be shamed into change. We're not dealing with big business and capitalists and white people who can be shamed into change. So one, the state that is intractable, 2, capitalists, manipulators who are fighting who don't want to change either. 2 big things. And I'm not sure whether intellectual critiques can move us. It's important, but I don't know if you can move this. As I said, I'm at a point where I don't know, sometimes I'm displaying a bit. But my name is Tshepo. Tshepo means I'm the soul. So I won't be so. This is very personal.
Thank you, Prof. You keep mentioning how we mustn't romanticize the movement, but I find that the concept of romanticizing is also in itself a politicized tool to quiet the discussion. And I've also, in my research with Abahlali, every time I speak, I'm always, you know, don't romanticize. I've got, from people I respect, yeah, you've been telling me, don't romanticize. I haven't even come to talk. Bigger piece of romanticizing. And so then my next question, okay, what is this romanticizing? Are we talking about giving all, in our analysis, we must give up the good and the bad, okay, the good and the bad. But then in response to that, I also then find is that what happens is that when you say the movement does A, B, and C, what you end up having is that there's this idea of, even, especially among academics, there's a weird preconceived notion of how political activism and organization can happen. And so I'm also very wary of recognize, okay, but they do this, and like for me, it's like, for example, with the whole DA, they're voting at that time. And one of the things that's never brought up is that actually Abahlali is not just one, it's not this single entity of everyone thinks the same. There were processes behind that where actually people voted. So I would keep like people voted as to a way forward. And the thing is, remember, these are like there's a whole bunch of people behind.
And so that vote in itself doesn't even represent the full truth of how the movement imagined itself. And one of the key things that I noted when doing my work and research was that this idea that, you know, I found at the committee level, very radical, very like, I think a lot of talks of Marx, you know, dismantling the state, but then when you go and meet members and stuff, people just want to get, people are in the movement, not necessarily for the same things as what the committee above wants. And so like, one of the things that like must be understood is that we need to understand that even within this movement, there's even dissenting or different views within it. And so if we recognize that, then just even say like, okay, but then what does it mean to romanticize? You know? What are the tools? I would even say, what should me as an academic who wants to do the work and understanding movements, how can I not fall into the trap of assuming this is the way to do political organizations, and therefore my critique is based on my preconceived ideas? Because I would think that's what everyone should be doing, but actually it's not the case. Would you have maybe some tips? Because I myself do not want to be accused of romanticizing the movement. So please tell me. Thank you.
Well, you've said everything. Number one, that, yeah, you know, I'm an academic, so I'm always, you know, skepticism, you know, and helping room for doubt, you know, and therefore don't make big claims, don't romanticize, so forth. So it's an instinct. It's an instinct, you know. So that's where it comes from. It's an instinct, and also in this kind of spaces, you know, beds, UCT, Oxford, you know, you are so scared that you're accused of making big claims. You know? But number two, you're correct that it's a depoliticizing instrument, actually, you know, and that word is only used in relation to certain scholarship and certain movements, but not some other ones. Why? You know, so it's not an innocent characterization. It's a political tactic. It's a political tactic. I completely agree with you. And number three, you know, you are quoted that, is it because we are saying we are coming with an aporia vision that I have conceptualized for my office, you know, for my desktop research and from researching from the archives. And when I go to movements, if they don't fit that, I say they are lacking and therefore we should not implement it. So is it based on me idealizing a certain revolutionary organizing and doing things, you know? So I think you've said all that, you know, perhaps we say not romanticize at a personal level is because you are saying it's not perfect. Because it's not perfect because it doesn't fit this narrative. But who said that narrative, you know? But then your last question about, yes, okay, leave those three aside. How do I make sure that I make scholarship and a true scholarship that is valid, that is verifiable, that is so-called objective? You know, is that what people mean when they say don't fall to that table? Are they saying your methods and the methodologies must be ethical, must be, you know, valid and so forth? Is that what it means? I don't know, but yeah, I take the point for you. I don't have tips, you know. I did my sociology masters on the organization that I was working for, Kulumani Support Group, you know. It was a participatory action research on our movement, Kulumani Support Group. So you can imagine in that context that half of it I'm trying to show that I'm not romanticizing. To the point where for a year I could not write, I couldn't do anything for a year, stuck, you know. But yeah, I'll take that for the complete.
Nope. Nope. No, it's just comments.
Are there any other questions in the room? You hear me? You had a question? No?
if there's any relevance to my question with regard to this particular lecture. There's been some changes in UK policies recently. So the Scottish National Party has elected a new First Minister for Scotland of Asian origin. So that means that Scotland and England have got Asian leaders. So it's the first of its kind. Is there a possibility that the politics that's taking place in the UK can also have an influence on the shift in political mindsets in South Africa as well as towards the 2024 presidential elections in terms of the new parties, new systems, new leaders coming into the fore of the political stage?
No question.
Double question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I heard you speaking about, this fatigue that is going on. So my question is like, in the midst of this fatigue now, what do we do, like to there? Because maybe when I was outside, I didn't hear you like saying, okay, this is maybe the definite thing or the possible way that we can proceed. But you did say that the avenue that we invested and there's this kind of fatigue, in terms of some problems are structural, some are bottom up. So what do you propose? You like we agree with Pano when he talks about the need now to eventually in order for these concerns to be held to take up arms or a revolutionary action of some kind, or we should just alleviate and pray and open for
So one of the things that we are trying to do is we have set up something called the Social Justice Assembly, the Social Justice Assembly. And that assembly brings together NGOs, trade unions, youth groups, women's groups, non-nationals into an assembly towards a new agenda of social justice. We don't know what it will look like, but what we know is that we can't operate in silos anymore. Some people are doing electoral reform, some people are doing women's rights space, some people are doing, anti-eviction work. We need to come together in the first place. Secondly, we need an assembly, and we had one in January, a big one in Pretoria, and we are now going to have provincial assemblies, where we bring together people and say, what is the solution? I don't have a solution, but I think one of the first that we need to do in the midst of this activist fatigue, repression, funding crisis. As a director of an NGO, I spend my time writing funding proposals rather than thinking strategically, because it's no funding now. We're struggling for funding, in the whole sector. So in the midst of all and repression and state repression of activism. So in the midst of that, without giving up, we need to unite, we need to come together in the assembly and propose solutions. So what I want to say to you is that I'm hoping that this structure, and there are other initiatives, this is what I said, only initiative, because we recognize all of us that we are at the crossroads in South Africa, and we need to do something. But what that thing is, we don't know. So that's what we're doing. Assemblies, to do this, in the midst of that. And the youth are very important in this. Every time we go to these assemblies, if you ask who's over 25, or who's under 25, it will only be one person. So we are saying we are coming together in this assembly to propose solutions, but the youth are not there. I teach youth, young in the university. Sense of despair. I just want to get my degree and go to London, on the pandemic in some of the townships. 70% of youth unemployed, So the youth are critical, if we say that 2/3 of South Africans are beyond the age of 27. So yeah, I don't have solutions, but that's what we try to do, to unite, to get out of operating in silos, to think structural, not to think in terms of the symptoms. Lack of housing, violations of human rights, those are symptoms of what? That's what we need to do. The first question I'll leave it to the chair of political theory, whether, but yeah, it's interesting that, yeah, Hamza has just been elected. That side is sooner, in the UK. And that, we might go to the independence, the breaking up of the UK. That's what it is that Asian origin actually lead to the dismantling of the UK. But what does that mean for us? In the context that those two are not very progressive. Suna is from the Conservative Party, right? Hamza is from the party that is, okay, but not very radical. So does that change your representation? Will it have global significance, global ramifications? I don't know, but I'll leave it to the South African, UK chair.
I must tell you, there's one last question. Sorry, Tshepo. It's Betani.
Exactly, there's one last question, so I don't have to answer you.
Go on and just state it.
Just one last question and asking for a comment. A comment on the political economy of silence that comes from the NGO sector. The other side is the one who holds the whip of silence, a powerful, cunning entity, but thoroughly deodorized as a holy helper. Sorry, the text just jumped in front of me. Holy helper through a laundry stretching centuries. He's proffered as genuinely innocent in the blood that capital comes into the world, dripping dead to toe with, a word to Marx. This dancing arena is a shared space where the thesis and the antithesis, the slave and the master, the toiler and the capitalist clasp hands and body in a deadly sway that leaves only cascades of misery and grief in its wake. How do we break this political economy of silence in our spaces from these NGOs? Sorry if I garbled that.
Yeah, I don't have the answer, but yeah, there's a lot of silence in the so-called NGO sector. None of us talk about capitalism. None of us. We talk about lack of food crisis, evictions, but there are big discourses that are missing. Capitalism. None of the feminist national organization in South Africa. There are women's groups, but feminism and patriarchy. So there are a lot of silences, in the NGO sector. Shivji from the texts, silences in the NGO discourse in the 1980s. I don't know what is the solution, we are donor funded. Does that make us independent? Number two, can philanthropy funded organization lead to revolution? People who are funded by philanthropy, can they elect and instigate the revolution? I don't know, but yeah, there are a lot of silences, and yeah, my hope is that we can recognize that our way of doing it has been very liberal. We've won cases, we win cases all the time, but the material conditions of people are not changing. So and this crisis that we are in is what creates a wonderful moment for us to rethink, the way our paradigms, the reimagining, how we do things. So I don't know the answer, and I'm saying this crisis forces us to unearth some of the silences and to reimagine some of the paradigms.
Many thanks. You hear me right?
Yep.
Just before we end off, I don't think there are any more questions. I should take the responsibility to answer the question about South Africa and the UK. My opinion is that it's obviously a very important moment for the UK in the sense of having these two Indian leaders in a place that's obviously been very white dominated. But I think you've got to see, and obviously identity-based politics plays a bit of a role here. So it can be exaggerated, its significance. I think Tshepo has put his finger on it, that really what counts is what they stand for rather than the color of their skin, frankly. And if they're, in one case, Conservative Party standing for clearly a very elite structure, then there's not much hope you can hold out there in regards to the kinds of things that we have had concern for today. I'm less well up on the SNP in general and the leadership there. You're thinking about this in terms of, I don't know where your question is coming from, but if you're thinking about it in terms of South Africa and whether leaders can be of any hue, as it were, then maybe it does have some significance. But I mean, our concern today, I mean, especially of course this wonderfully rich presentation and discussion, is not so much about, you know, the race or the hue or the skin color of a leader, although leaders play really, really important roles in these kinds of things. It's about how to face a very, very dire situation with, first of all, how to diagnose well a dire situation. And I think obviously Abahlali and others, and this great talk is a wonderful way of diagnosing it. And once the diagnosis is in place, the big question is how to proceed forward. And I think that your social justice network has got to be really a really important means of doing so, because there is this tendency around the world where the populist or technocratic, but it's a tendency that's very firmly entrenched in democracy, that in some sense the representatives have to come up with all the answers. But assemblies of ordinary people can come up sometimes with the best answers. So it's not necessarily, I don't think Tshepo and others' claims are that we should all be ruling ourselves in some utopian world, but it's just that these kinds of assemblies can be very generative of great ideas. So thanks all, and thanks so much to Tshepo for a fascinating discussion. And just to say finally, before you all sign off, the decolonisation theme continues in our next talk, which does not yet have a date, but it'll be given by Michael Eze from Leiden and associated with Cambridge. So that will probably be June, July sometime, the third of the 2023 chair talks. Many thanks all.
Thank you.